I own, and I think most of you own, one of the most dangerous inventions of all time. I'm talking about the snooze button on our alarm clocks or clock radios, or these days an alarm app on our phones or iPads. Now, I don't know about you, but as far as I'm concerned, I wish that little button didn't exist. It seems that every morning when the radio, or in my case these days, my phone, begins blaring in my ear, I sleepily reach over and hit or swipe the snooze button, which just happens to be an easy target because it's easily seen on my phone screen. Anyway, before I know it, I've managed to snuggle down under the covers and return to dreamland, happy to ignore my wake-up call. Unfortunately, I repeat this routine over and over again, and often to the point that I end up being really late getting out of bed. When my cat was much younger, she didn't have a snooze button, and her insistent cries for breakfast finally managed to make me emerge from the warmth and comfort of my bed. Fortunately or unfortunately, she's coming to the end of her life and she doesn't do that anymore, so I can still go down for a while. Anyway, this morning we heard once again the story about Saul of Tarsus and his incredible journey from Jerusalem to Damascus. This is a story of transformation, and many people point out it is a conversion story. Now, most of us have heard this story before. We know about Saul and how eager he was to search for and hunt down those rebellious followers of Jesus. He was the one who held the coats for the men who stoned Stephen, as you might recall, who was the first Christian martyr. Saul was a Pharisee. He knew the laws of Jewish tradition backwards and forwards, and he expected people to obey those laws to the letter. As this morning's story begins, Saul has set out on a 140-mile trip from Jerusalem to Damascus because he's heard about a bunch of Jesus followers in Damascus, and Saul was determined to grab them, arrest them, and throw them in prison. After all, Saul reasoned these silly followers of Jesus were breaking all the traditional rules of the synagogue, and they had to be dealt with according to the laws. Saul just couldn't allow any upstart rebels to get away with preaching about the risen Jesus and God's powerful love and forgiveness. What might be interesting to note here is that Saul was also a student of Gamaliel. Remember him from last Sunday? Maybe you don't. Anyway, he was the one voice of tolerance and humility in the midst of anger and fear. When the temple leaders wanted to kill Peter and the others for preaching, teaching, and healing, Gamaliel pointed out that maybe, just maybe, this resurrected Jesus might be for real. And maybe, just maybe, messing with God wasn't such a good idea. Now, we'll never know whether Saul paid any attention to Gamaliel's voice of reason that day on the way to Damascus or not. But what we do know is that suddenly, out of nowhere, Saul fell down on the ground, struck by a light so bright it was blinding, and Saul couldn't see a thing. But he could hear, and the voice that called to him was the voice of Jesus, who wanted to know why Saul was caught up in hate and persecution. Why are you doing these things, Saul? Now's the time Saul might have decided to hit his snooze button, turn over and just give up. After all, he didn't have to get up and follow the voice of Jesus, giving him this wake-up call. Saul had a choice. He could have easily ignored the voice of Jesus. He could have had his friends take him back to Jerusalem. He could have followed found the nearest hotel and doctor and hoped that the blindness was temporary. Saul could have just gone on as before, business as usual. There really wasn't any reason for Saul to change the direction of his life that day. But that's not what Saul did. Blind as a bat, he got up and asked his companions to lead him into Damascus as Jesus told him. And there he waited for 3 days until help arrived. And help did arrive, even though it was reluctant help. Ananias wanted his snooze button too that day that Jesus gave him a wake-up call, telling him to get over to Saul's place and take care of him. Ananias tried pounding his snooze button, but it just wouldn't work. Jesus wasn't about to listen to any excuses Ananias offered. You know, Jesus, Ananias pleaded, that Saul guy is going to beat me up when I get to his door. That's what he does with people who follow you. Don't you understand, Jesus? As much as I love you and want to follow you, there are limits. You can't expect me to put my life in jeopardy. Come on, Jesus, Ananias insisted. Saul is going to murder me, even if he is blind. But Jesus wasn't about to take no for an answer, and finally, Ananias managed to get himself away from that snooze button and knock on Saul's door. Ananias, with the help of the Holy Spirit, had healed Saul that day, and Saul's sight was restored, and the rest, as we said, is history. Saul was converted right then and there, and he ended up spreading the good news of Jesus Christ throughout the world. That's the story of Saul's conversion to the person we know as Paul. As I was reading the story this week, there was one verse that kept gnawing away at me. It's the one that says, though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. You know, I think that describes us very well. How often do we have open eyes, but we don't see a thing? It's as if we're continuing to punch the snooze button, making it easy for us to turn over and ignore God's wake-up call. We may have open eyes, but we refuse to see the Spirit of God reaching out to us, calling us to change those parts of ourselves that we know need to be changed. Just don't want to have to deal with God reaching into the very depths of our souls and changing us. We try to tell God that we love God, but there are limits to what we're willing to do. It's a whole lot easier for us to hang on to our old ways. We just don't feel like getting up and heading off into a new direction, even if God is leading the way. We cling to our old notions, to our old prejudices, to our old hurts and wounds. Our eyes are open, but we refuse to see new possibilities for ourselves and for the Church of Jesus Christ. Okay, so now we're going to begin talking about our gospel story this morning. And in case you didn't notice, it has a lot to do with fish. So, before we continue with the sermon, I find that it's probably a really good idea for me to share a couple of fish stories with you, just to get that out of the way. So, once upon a time, there was a fisherman who was tired of people doubting his veracity. He bought a scale and took it with him to his favorite fishing hole. He insisted on weighing every fish he caught, just to prove that he didn't exaggerate. Months later, his wife had a baby. The doctor borrowed the man's fishing scale to weigh the baby. The doctor gasped. "I've never seen a newborn baby," he said, "that weighed 50 pounds. Okay, so here's one more. Someone said that the difference between a hunter and a fisherman is that the hunter lies and waits, and the fisherman waits and disciples who found themselves facing some of the same dilemmas we church people face. You see, time had passed since they had last seen the resurrected Jesus. Maybe they were disappointed that life hadn't changed very much for them after all. Perhaps it's no wonder they decided to return to their old way of living. If Jesus wasn't going to be around to keep them going, why bother? After all, I think it's reasonable to assume that these disciples needed to make some sort of living. They had to eat, and they still had families to support back home in Galilee. Not only was Galilee home, it was also where everything had begun for them, and so it was quite normal for them to return once it seemed everything had come to an end. According to our gospel story this morning, there were 7 of them, which meant they were already coming apart at the seams, some going in one direction while others went in another. Now, these 7 decide to go fishing, and that shouldn't be any surprise for us because fishing was, after all, their occupation. That's what they did before Jesus turned up on one day, and that's what they all got back to when Jesus disappeared. As far as the disciples were concerned, gone was gone, and Jesus was gone. Memory is one thing, but the future is another. Jesus' life on earth may have ended, but the disciples were still very much alive, and they had to do something about putting food on the table and roofs over their heads. Jesus was gone, and now it was time to begin looking out for themselves again. You see, our disciples had a bad case of post-resurrection blues. With nothing to look forward to, they climb back into their boat and head out to do some fishing. They all seem listless and moody. I think we can understand how they felt. Most likely we've all experienced some sort of letdown in our lives. We can get ourselves excited about all sorts of things. For instance, at Christmas time, we get ourselves so involved with all the planning and preparations that when the big day comes and goes, we may be left with a feeling of emptiness. Or maybe we get ourselves caught up in the wonder and anticipation of a vacation trip. We're going to visit friends and family we haven't seen for a long time. And sometimes all that wonder and anticipation ends up in disappointment if our expectations aren't met as we had wished. So the disciples in the boat were going through the same things we experience when disappointment and disillusionment creep into our lives. But for our sad disciples, there was more disappointment to come. There they were, out in the middle of the lake, swatting at the mosquitoes and cursing the heat as if that wasn't bad enough. There weren't any fish to be found. Yes, indeed, these guys had one bad case of post-resurrection blues. Just as the disciples were moaning, groaning, and complaining, they heard a voice yelling at them. The voice cried out, "Hey, fellas, I bet you don't have any fish, do you? Why don't you try tossing your nets to the other side of the boat, for goodness sakes?" The disciples decide to give it a try. What's the worst that can happen, they reasoned. Maybe the guy on shore knows something we don't. Wouldn't you know? As soon as the nets are thrown onto the other side, the water begins to churn and boil up with fish. Fish all over the place. Some are even pushed right up out of the water, their shiny fins glinting in the morning light. And then the light dawns on them. They are seeing again for the first time. Post-resurrection blues have disappeared. It was like deja vu. The boats, the nets, the stranger calling out to them. It wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And then they saw another light. The light of copper-colored coals glowing in the sand, smoke rising in the air. As the disciples got to shore, they could smell the wood burning and hear the fish sizzling over the flame. Breakfast on the beach. And not just any breakfast. this was the first breakfast, the first meal of their new life together, a resurrection breakfast prepared by the only one who had the recipe. Isn't it amazing how 1 minute the disciples were filled with despair, disappointment, and post-resurrection blues, and the next minute they're having breakfast on the beach with Jesus? It can't get any better than that. Now, this is a fine story as far as it goes, but what in the world does it have to do with us? Especially for those of us who may be experiencing our own version of the post-resurrection blues. It might just be that John has given us this story so that we can turn our post-resurrection blues into practicing resurrection. That is, instead of disappointment in our unfulfilled expectations, we can allow resurrection to define our lives. Just as the disciples discovered, Easter isn't the end, it's just the beginning. One author describes practicing resurrection this way: Jesus comes to us and calls us to practice resurrection with no expectation of being perfect. The disciples' days of poor judgments and mistakes weren't over after the breakfast on the beach. Jesus knew that. And yet he called the disciples to practice resurrection anyway, without any thought of being perfect or even successful. Clarence Jordan practiced resurrection by forming a Christian community called Koinonia in Georgia during the 1940s and 50s. The community was open to all people of all races and ethnicities in a time when the world around them was segregated. One night, the Ku Klux Klan visited the Koinonia farm and burned down all the buildings, except the one in which Jordan and his family lived. That building they riddled with gunshot. During the raid, Jordan recognized the voice of one of the hooded attackers that belonged to a local newspaperman. The next day, Jordan returned to the fields to hoe and plant, continuing the work to which he had been called. Out into the field walked the reporter heard the night before. "Well, Jordan," he said, "I guess we'll be moving on now after all this damage." To which Jordan made no reply, but continued to hoe and plant, hoe and plant. "Well, Mr. Jordan," inquired the reporter, "what is your reaction to last night's incident?" Jordan continued to hoe and plant, hoe and plant. "Mr. Jordan, what do you think? You've worked here for 14 years and all that you've built lies in ruins. What do you think now that everything you've worked for has failed?" At which Clarence Jordan stopped hoeing, looked the unmasked Klansman in the eye and said, "You just never have understood about us Christians. It's not about being successful. It's about being faithful." And he went back to hoeing and planting. This is the third Sunday of the Easter season. We continue to celebrate with wonder and amazement the power of the risen Christ to transform lives. Christ continues to be in our midst, inviting us to get up and turn ourselves around. Come on, Christ calls us. Change directions. Stop finding excuses to curl up and go back to sleep. Get up, get going, come and follow me. The road where Christ leads us will have bumps and ruts, twists and turns, but it will be the road that will also lead us to wonderful new possibilities, to new ideas, and to a transforming faith. May each of us hear the call